Hello, everyone. My name is Marcella Walsh, Live Content Coordinator at AVIXA, and welcome to our Smart Buildings Power Hour. We will be hosting 2 Smart Buildings Power Hours in October, and today's topic is Control and Backbone. Joining us today is Bob Snyder, Editor-in-Chief, Channel Media, and publisher of Smart Building News, Digital Signage News EMEA, European Solution Provider, and more. For the past 10 years, he has been the content chairman for the Smart Building Conference at ISE. Before I hand over the presentation to Bob, there are a few housekeeping items. For those viewing live, today's webinar qualifies for 1 CTS, CTSD, and CTSI RU credit. Please allow 5 to 7 business days to view on your transcripts. For any issues, please email webinars@avixa.org. The webinar will be approximately 45 to 60 minutes, and all attendees will be placed on mute. If you have questions during the presentation, please enter them into the Q&A window so today's moderator can address them at the end of the webinar. To access the Q&A window, simply move your cursor to the bottom of your live stream video box and locate the Q&A icon and click to open. Please do not enter your questions into the chat window. You will have access to this recorded webinar at avixa.org/webinars within about 5 business days. And now I will hand things over to Bob. Bob, take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Smart Building Power Hour. Thank you very much. I'm going to be talking to everybody today from the point of view of bringing everybody together and catching up on the trends and the latest news in the Smart Buildings Power Hour. Can everybody see my slides, by the way?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to, first of all, talk for a minute about the Power Hour roadmap, and just to say that we're dealing with such a very large subject in the smart building that it's hard to cover it in even 10 sessions of 1 hour each. But we hope by breaking it into segments, it makes it easier for people to jump in where they want and to understand a few things in different specialized areas without us having the ability to go in great depth because it's only an hour session. The other significant thing to be aware of is the fact that so many things in smart building overlap. We can't talk about security just on one session. It's going to come up in many places. Things like IoT come up practically in every session. So it's not a strict compartmentalization. It's more of a guide, and it more reflects some of the experts that we'll bring in to talk about the different subjects. So the experts that I've brought in today, I'm very pleased to have with us Philip Junot. And Philip is the Chief Commercial Officer for Automated Technology Company, ATC, and also Vice President of KNX, the USA National Group. And Philip's, the mission for ATC is to transform today's buildings into tomorrow's net zero infrastructure by ensuring the highest levels of safety, comfort, and efficiency for the overall well-being of the occupants and the overall environment. Philip has more than 25 years of experience here and working for multinationals. So Philip, thank you and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My next guest is Bob Ferguson, and Bob is the Channels Account Manager, Broadcast Audio and Video Division at Belden. Thank you, Bob, for joining us. His primary focus revolves around solving technical issues and answering design questions for consultants, engineers, end users, and systems integrators. That makes you perfect, Bob, for this group. And before working at Belden, he was a specialist before working for Belden as a specialist in audio and video, Bob worked in Silicon Valley in Northern California as a manufacturer's rep for low voltage network cabling market. And Bob, of course, has the RCDD designation for BICSI and the CTS1 certification from AVIXA. Thank you, Bob, for joining us today. And I've also am pleased to have with us Jamie Swigert, who is the Director of AV Sales and Business Development Enterprise Markets. and for Panduit, and he's currently responsible for the Atlona brand's sales and development teams. And Jamie was serving as Panduit's Senior Business Development Manager and Product Line Manager for Panduit's fiber optic cables, connectors, and termination tools, racks, cable management products. And prior to Panduit, he worked as the telecom manager for the Charleston County government, where he's in charge of design, implementation, maintenance of network infrastructure and information. So welcome, Jamie.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you guys for joining me. I'm going to take the stage for a couple minutes just to talk about control and moving forward. But I wanted to underline first, that what we're dealing with in all of these smart buildings power hours is the digital disruption of building. And this is much like the digital disruption we've all seen in our lives, whether it's been in bookstores, record shops, or even over the top television and streaming. Digital disruption is a process that's an evolution, and it takes time. And this is a development that's been going on for decades already in smart building, and we're going to be talking about some new things, but there's some things that just keep coming up. You can't kill them. They just keep coming back as a subject. And I wanted to mention to everybody who's here who would like to go more in depth technically, that there is my friend Phil Zito, who couldn't join us today because he has a conference of his own, but Phil is like Mr. Building Automation System when you talk about control, and he has his Smart Buildings Academy. They have a course called Building Automation Fundamentals. It tells you how a building automation works. It tells you about common controls. It's a good way to get really intimate with it. And he offers a number of other courses as well. But I wanted to say to the audience that the point of the Smart Buildings Power Hour is not to suggest that everybody is going to become a master systems integrator or even a smart building consultant. A lot of what we hope is that people will find what part and what aspect means the most to them in their business, so that if you're working in the built environment, you have the proper background if you want to specialize in workplace, or if you want to specialize in smart office, or if you do want to go and become a master systems integrator, it's not a bad place to start as well. So we don't expect you to learn everything today, but I want to cover a few basic things about control systems and a few basic things that are trends that may catch your interest along the way here. First of all, in case it's confusing, BAS, Building Automation Systems, it's actually pretty much the same as Building Management Systems, the BMS. They're interchangeable in the industry in most cases, but you do run into the BEMS or the EMS, which is an energy management system, which is a different system entirely, although they collaborate. But it's important, if you've come across these acronyms, to know what they are. We even have an evolution where some people are calling it an Intelligent Building Management System, IBMS. It sounds like an intercontinental missile, doesn't it? But it's basically an all over IP or a all management system. These systems, are generally built by very significant companies with resources, and the important thing is to know perhaps how they interface and some of the trends in the control systems along the way. We'll be talking here about backbone, which was just a shorter way of suggesting network infrastructure, but the IoT industry, as well as other parts of technology, need to interface with the control system. This building automation system industry, is a growing business. It, like everything else, will be held up by the corona, and it will have an impact on the industry, but is not expected to totally block it or even dent the overall enthusiasm during the next series of years. And the trends that are driving the growing building automation system business is energy efficiency, of course. Energy is the primary mover for smart buildings, and strict building codes, which are there for sustainability and for climate, are also encouraging people to look at what they're using for new buildings along the way. AI has come along, and the artificial intelligence promises to change the building automation platforms in three ways. One, through analytics that are actually built into the platform. Two, through analytics embedded in the equipment that's used around the platform. And three, from supplemental analytics that are designed to cover other parts of building operation and feed the data into a master control panel. 9% of worldwide revenue, so by the time this year ends, we maybe 10% of the market is going to be influenced by artificial intelligence. It's not to be overrated, but yet it's something that is an up and coming impact on the control side. And one of the biggest challenges of it is that it, like everything else it seems in the smart building, suffers from a lack of standardization from the data. The history of the building industry has evolved so that a lot of the technologies were based originally in silos. And from those silos, we've gathered a lot of what they call sleeping data, which is somewhere, but not where it should be in order to be utilized. And the AI offers us a chance to pull that data out and to use it in an intelligent way. It's a very important, some people are arguing the next decade is going to be a battle for the smart building industry to secure that data and turn it into meaningful data in order for the industry to meet what its expectations are. Along that way, I wanted to mention two things. One is the Google Digital Buildings Project. So Google is a landlord, and being a high-tech company with a complex to solve all the world's problems, they of course conquered their own problems, and along the way they got very irritated by the lack of standardization. So one of the things that they have done is they've offered on GitHub, you can find the benefit of Google's attempt to standardize the uniform information about the data that's in a building, and they are using it in 130 buildings in the California area currently and sharing it to build a common vocabulary. So this is one of the problems that we're going to be talking with our experts about, is the lack of standardization and the nomenclature that we need to do our jobs. And it's not just Google who's addressing it. For example, IP Bliss, which is not particularly well known yet, but it's not a new organization. It's a collection of existing organizations that most people in smart building would recognize, who have come to the conclusion that they need to align together to communicate that there should be a common networking onboarding, and a shared secure network communication procedures to be applied so that there is a common denominator to the building control and management systems. And IP Bliss literally had the disadvantage of rolling out in COVID, which is probably why it's less known than it would normally be. But these are companies that intend to invest together to cooperate to try to solve this problem that, it's fine to have control systems, but if you can't get the data out, get it standardized and share it, then you're missing a lot of the control points of view. So with that in mind, I wanted to also mention that most people feel that building control is only for very large buildings, and historically that is probably true. The trend that you might want to underline is the trend to what they're calling micro or mini BMS. And these are designed for smaller buildings. And the one I've picked out to show today is the Fin Micro BMS from J2 Innovations. They're a Siemens company. It's got a lot of features. It's designed for small and medium businesses and works across multiple sites. I think that's one of the significant things we should be mentioning during the course of today. Now, with some of those points in the background, I wanted to turn to one of my guests. I wanted to turn to Phil, who has just completed a project, and this is the ABB Industrial Automation Headquarters for the company based in Highland Hills, Ohio. And it's the first KNX commercial field applications across multiple trades and protocols with a streamlined IP interface to the overall building energy management system. But Phil, I wanted you to just take us through some of the challenges and some of the rationale behind what you did when you confronted this project. Phil?
Yeah, well, hello everyone. Pleased to be here, and I appreciate it, Bob, for the invite. Yeah, this was a great project. When we say first KNX, the feedback was, oh, okay, there are other KNX installations. Well, what's meant is the KNX is actually across two main trades, and that is the lighting and the HVAC in the room and in the space. And that's what we did. And typically those are in silos. They'll typically be on maybe a proprietary lighting system and a backnet, for example, system on BMS. And with that being said, what we did is we took KNX as a technology, which is more prevalent where you are, Bob, in Belgium and in Europe and
Yes.
Asia Pacific, right? So KNX is a standard actually in China. But in the US, it's really not known very well. And, we're pushing that in the organization of KNX USA. And this was a wonderful opportunity. And I guess the challenges I would say to answer your question was starting in the design phase. So we came in at the end of a design that was already made. So there were already specifications made. And we had come in to look at it and said, okay, well, we want to actually bring the protocols together. So really streamlining on the design side, the protocols themselves, okay? A lot of times in the specification, it'll get technical, but they'll list possibly, proprietary maybe protocol, or they'll list the manufacturers. A proper specification will put in pure technical, and there should be companies that can be listed that follow all those requirements. But that's where an open standard would come in, like KNX, for example. And that's why people can use KNX, because there are over 800 manufacturers to actually provide the solution, which is nice. So it gives integrators like ourselves the ability to choose, along with maybe customers who maybe have a preference for a specific manufacturer. So the design, when we came in at the end, we had to revise specification, okay, all good, worked with the engineers, but then when it went into implementation, that's where, when a technology is not known so much, it had its challenges getting it installed correctly and commissioned and all that. But actually, once we got over those small hurdles, they're hurdles like any other project, we were able to really find that once it's installed properly, you had the real streamlined commissioning. So KNX provides the ability to actually bring those data points in a very simplistic way from an HVAC system and a lighting system and bring those together, because it's one communication, and you're able to do those things in the space that you couldn't do if you were isolated, if you know what I mean, okay? So concrete example, in this space, and this is nice for COVID these days, because in this building, it's actually done with a lot of ceiling PIR sensors, okay, passive infrared. So those are actually taking, the occupancy, the actual occupancy in the area, to turn lights on and off and to enable the HVAC in that space. So it would be a variable air volume, let's say, box that you're controlling the damper. And what we can do is, when that presence there, people don't have to touch anything. So that's actually great for COVID. So in this space, everything is all automated. And basically you have a couple of HMIs or interfaces on conference rooms, and that's it. So it's really built, actually, we didn't know this is before COVID. So it's actually built for COVID, which is nice. So again, the challenge is more on the education, because the protocols themselves will, on open standards, that is, will have, those things that need to be understood and you need to be trained. But once you have done that, you understand it, it's really, really simple.
Okay. And Philip, if I can ask it, and you know, my panel is invited to jump in too, but you know, so the building, you know, in terms of a building automation system, it has a building automation system, and it has a building energy management system, and it has KNX. And one of the things I wanted to underline or to point out is in this smart building area, how these overlapping technologies, you know, have to come to play, which is why we have integration issues in the first place, and why, you know, integrators are necessary and people who cross disciplinary areas in order to figure out how it comes together. But, you know, in terms of the stakeholders, I mean, you had a stakeholder who was already enthusiastic about smart building and about industrial automation, so it makes it a much easier project. One of the things that popped up, you know, in looking at the control systems is the fact that so many of the stakeholders really, you know, they're putting things out to bid. They were looking for the lowest, you know, common denominator. They're not looking, you know, it'd be like, you know, buying a car through a bid, and you get the lowest car if you get what you paid for, you know, and that. Okay, any other questions that we have on the KNX project from the panel?
So when you looked at it, and I think you mentioned it earlier, Bob, right, the silos, I think that's the big barrier of, you know, how do you get the HVAC and the lighting, which you were able to get to work together, but, you know, how do you then incorporate that to, you know, an AV silo or, you know, the security silo? You know, I think that's the big challenge. And, you know, to your point of, you know, if you've got all these different disciplines that are typically separately bidded, you've got to either have a really, really strong, you know, specification or designer going in, or an owner that says, hey, this would be really cool if we could tie all these systems in. Here's a smart lighting system that can do this. I can tie it in, you know, to control the lighting, control this, all based on occupancy. You know, that I think is the big barrier that we see.
If Bob, I may be able to comment on that. I'd like to hear from Jamie as well, or anybody else. There's a couple of things I want to point out. That this project is not just KNX. This KNX protocol goes up to an IP convergence platform, which is our Ascend platform, which is actually an IBMS, so Intelligent Building Management System. So we have over 53 native protocols on there. So we can actually do REST apps, we can do MQTT, the gamut. So, you know, probably stated we were able to bring IP convergence to break down those silos. But to your point, Bob, it's going through, it's important to have that in the design. And I can only emphasize that there's a Division E5 specification called integrated automation. If it's used in the design phase, it would solve all the issues. But again, it's a standard that's there in the specification industry. But as you know, Bob mentioned, if it's not implemented, you know, it needs to be implemented. So the standards are there. It just needs to be applied. And this is rather new as well. So we have to understand we're in new territory. So you know, you're bringing in a new protocol, IP convergence, and then all of a sudden, you know, you want to put all that together, a customer kind of boggles their mind. So you got to do it in steps. And the design phase is the right way.
Did question, you know, from the audience here, but did in terms of the BMS lighting example, did you quantify the initial cost estimates for the client so they could evaluate ROI, or did they?
Well, it was you. I was a former ABB employee, so I had privy to it. Although we had to, that was even more scrutiny because when I left the company to start my own, then I became a customer. Oh, sorry, the other side. So. It was more of a challenge. So yeah, we showed them the savings on cable, number one. KNX have one cable that has power and communication, okay? And based on that, and by the way, they are Belden. So it's Belden KNX. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
So, you know, and Belden's one of our partners. Anyway, because the communication is streamlined, the installation only has one wire to run, one cable, as opposed to two separate, and they're low voltage, as opposed to high voltage and low voltage communication for the protocol. So you're saving a lot, number one, there. Secondly, you can save on devices. We had one PIR up on the ceiling. Well, if you had an HVAC and lighting installation, you'd have at least two, a thermostat and a switch. So you're saving on components, you're saving on wiring, and that's a fact.
Phil, you mentioned something at the beginning of your description. I think it's important maybe to reemphasize, which is your experience was you came in right at the end of the design process. And in my experience, it's very, very common. I've been involved in a number of opportunities where it's 90%, designed, and then suddenly somebody talks about a digital building, and then people are trying to sort of fit things into an existing model. It's very important, I think, for to avoid the types of challenges that you had, that the owners or the architects are thinking about the digital building or intelligent building from day one rather than on day 300 when they're about to go to bed.
Yeah. And Philip, can I ask you, did you connect up the conference room, digital displays, and the building AV also into the KNX infrastructure?
Oh, we wanted to, but that was a battle we lost. They went with another system which we could interface to. We just kept it separate. One of the things we did take in, again, being an IBMS, we connected to the electrical switchgear, EMAX 2 from ABB, which is intelligent switchgear, which you can do load shedding and also automated demand response if you want to connect it to the utility for additional savings. So it's really built in, and we can monitor power and then marry that data together with what's going on with the HVAC and the lighting. And even with the lighting, we have KNX and Dolly, so we can actually measure each fixture. So that's how in the building is. So with all that data, we have that on an IP convergence platform, again, our Ascend platform, but what we're able to do is we can do some algorithms and do some AI built into the software, which I liked your slide before, Bob, that mentioned that AI in the platform. And again, we had AI in the platform, and in some cases, we can put some algorithms in even the KNX devices. I mean, I wouldn't call it IA, but I would just call that intelligence.
Sure.
Doing all of that, and then as a controls engineer, one of the things I've learned, the more intelligence you bring down to the device level, the better. Okay, so you see nowadays, air handling unit systems that'll have a self-contained controller on BACnet, all done, and it makes things a lot simpler. So with the technology, there have been some great advancements that we've seen. We just got to take a few more steps further, and then we'll be there.
In the IT industry, they'd call that edge computing, moving the intelligence to where it's needed. And just one of the other readers had a question. I just want to make sure, did you put KNX on the network that was existing, or did you make an OT network for the KNX?
That's a great question, and it's a great to talk about. Being ABB, we wanted to go on, and we wanted to create basically a local area network, just a local network specific for our platform. So they basically set that up. Took a while. We still have problems where they'll reset something, and then all of a sudden the password, doesn't get updated, and then we don't update the password. So there are little nuances there, but we basically isolate ourselves from the system. And I think when you talk about OT being on the building management system side, I'm fully agreeing with that, because you're going on IP convergence. So if you're bringing it on an IP layer, you're running things, whether it's fiber or a normal patch cable, what have you. But at that time, when it is IP convergence, then you're able to connect into either a local area, what are we calling that now? It's even slipping in my mind. Just a local area network where you isolate on their platform. And I think that's because if you tie into their platform, and I've seen so many times where BMS company project that I've done recently, they tapped into the camera system, AV. Yeah. No one knew, customer didn't know, and then I bring it up, and it delayed the project 2-3 months because we actually brought in a separate service in, and we put a sonic wall, so we did our own security. So I think you said it right in your slide, just to probably give a more simplistic answer. It's really about working with the IT people, which we never used to as BMS people in the past. But one of the things, we have an IT engineer on staff. So it helps us because they can speak that language. I certainly can't. And I think that's important because if we're going to OT, we're going to be needing to do that. We need to educate also on the IT people.
Yeah. And I think this is one of the discussions we'll have going forward. I have another slide where we confront this question of, are we really going to have one network infrastructure for everything or not? That'll be coming up, so we don't have to address that at the moment. But the advantage you had in this case is you had a client that knows what smart building's about. You had a company that's willing to go along, and a lot of the problem in the smart building industry is convincing the stakeholders that they're investing in something, and this is why sometimes you end up with just the energy management system, because they find it easy to understand saving energy costs. They find it a lot harder to contemplate how they make workers more productive. Try proving that in an effective formula in that. So I'm going to move on to one more slide here, if you guys allow me to do that. So really, one of the things we're talking about is this question of how many networks do we need in a smart building, and multiple technologies supporting a structure that in the end has to be unified somehow. So one of the integrators I saw was recommending first a fiber-centric backbone network. I'll let my experts comment on that in a minute. And the second thing they wanted was a distributed antenna system so they could control a lot of the current cellular and the traditional Wi-Fi. And the third system they wanted was to help the IoT side, was to control the creation of all the sensors, and that's for a low power wide area network, to bring these more modern sensors into play. So for my panel, the question is, are we ever going to have a unified infrastructure, or are we going to have parallel structures that get unified, if I can say that, so.
I'll take it.
Anyone, Jamie?
I'll take a stab at it. So,
All right.
as you said in the introduction, I come out of the telecom world, and I remember when voice over IP was first coming on, and talking to a network engineer who said, "You'll never put voice on my network. We're going to segregate you. You're going to have your own switches, your own infrastructure." And it was 16 months later, we were running on the production local area network. Voice is one thing, AV is another, streaming 4K nonstop, all the IoT devices, you get into security concerns. So there are definitely challenges. IT and the smart people who make switches seem to find ways around things. And so while it may not be next year or the year after, I think eventually we will end up with a converged network, everything running on it, segregated by VLANs and appropriate security in place.
It's going to be interesting to see. Bob, you have a comment?
Yeah, I think where you'll see the adaptation first is they'll connect via the backbone, right? So you may have your own out to the devices, because the challenge that you have a lot of times, when you look at just kind of the AV, right, is the bandwidth differences. You mentioned video, Amy. Okay, I've got this, and I need this type of bandwidth for that. What's that phone system? What's that computer network need? So maybe it's a separate infrastructure there. But yeah, if I've got to travel that long distance, I've got a backbone. I can separate it on a VLAN, or at least use the same physical infrastructure and be able to connect it in. But the challenge, and I think you brought up, Philip, is as they update things, I think the challenge that the IT group has, and we've all seen it, right? If you get a software update for your system updates, and then, hey, 3 apps don't work. Well, if those 3 apps, your AV or your HVAC or that, you've got to really be tied those systems back in together if they're converged, that, hey, any upgrades need to be attested across the systems, because one thing may be able to change all these parameters.
I think one of the obvious things is that it takes smart people to make smart buildings. It's certainly complex, and it's not as simple as people think. I have a question from one of the audience, which is regarding, which network certifications, would you take to communicate better with IT as an AV programmer? So I don't know if anybody has any particular suggestions regarding networking certifications, but anybody? Okay, because Jamie?
I mean, sort of the obvious ones, right, are going for a CCNA or CCIE, but that's a pretty big first step, right? That's a pretty big commitment and requires a lot of learning and a lot of time. I know just through being involved with AVIXA, there are a number of, I'll call them like IT Lite certifications you can achieve through AVIXA. Probably wouldn't get you to the point of being able to program a network switch, but will get you familiar with terms, terminology, understanding network concepting and so forth. So there's probably a host of others. That's the one that I'm familiar with.
Sure. And my friends at CompTIA would probably like to have their certifications, and Cisco certifications are ubiquitous, let me say, and that. I'd like to also mention, again, my friend Phil Zito, because he has a program for people in the building technology to talk to IT specifically. So it may also work for AV programmers to talk to IT, because I'm assuming we need to find the common language in that. I'm going to move forward on one slide just because we seem to have hit this subject early, but this is two different points of view that come from two different people out of the industry, and I've borrowed their comments here. On the right, we see the single IP network, which is kind of like the dream, and the comment from one person is, I struggle to see the value in this term OT, which is operational technology. It's the technology that the building automation traditionalists have in place. And it says, I struggle to see the value because it creates a new opportunity for the BAS market to develop products that, without the necessary collaborations with the IT people. Wouldn't it be so much easier, if we just went along with the IT people and, they know what they're doing, they have a certain amount of experience, and Ethernet, should be the place where the line thins between VAS world and the IT world. The counterpoint of view from the other gentleman on the other side is there's a common misperception that IT will handle it all. And because of their vast networking experience. I think the vast was supposed to be facetious there. If we leave networking to IT, it does a disservice to us, our partners, our customers, and our systems, because IT doesn't know what we want as BAS, and we don't know what to ask for. So these two different points of view create this divide that's out there, and I'd like the panel to kind of address that, if you'd like.
Bob, can you show the slide, please?
Yeah, that's what I'm going to ask. If I may, and I'm sure either Bob or Jamie can chime in. Again, I'm not an IT person at all. I've been in BS my whole career, but again, collaboration with the IT. On that same ABB project, we work with the IT engineers, and believe it or not, because we're speaking two different languages at the beginning. And then finally we had our IT engineer came in, and then we understood nothing, and they understood each other, and it worked fine. Again, the things like updates and other things, that's more of a coordination thing. That's not a problem. It's really a collaboration between the two. So if there are updates, you would be informed before what they're doing, how that affects any of the apps or any of the platforms that they're connected to. And by the way, we had a VLAN at that ABB project. I couldn't think of the name, but to what Jamie was saying before. So I think it's just a really collaboration is key.
This language of this discussion, it reminds me so much of the discussions we've had in the past with AV and IT. And Jamie, I think out of telecom, you probably ran across this, because telecom and IT have such a various different cultures. They might as well be German people and French people having conversations. You know.
Yeah, they certainly did at one point. I'll tell you, as you talked to my bio, I worked for a local government, and I started out as part of the facilities management department. And by the time I left 7 years later, I was part of the IT department. And I think we're going to see the same thing in AV. And you probably will see at some point something similar happening with facilities managers who are managing these building management systems. I was going to comment, I don't have a great answer for you on whether or not we should use the term OT. To me, the intent is there regardless of what the word is, but it's interesting to me. So at Panduit, we're involved in selling products into the manufacturing environments, industrial plant floors. The exact same conversation is going on there. There they describe it as the carpeted floor versus the cement floor, but it's the same dynamic of IT running one network and the electricians and plant floor supervisors running the cement floor network, but the same convergence is happening, the same adaptation of products, the same sharing of responsibilities and need to work together. So while I don't have an answer, maybe people will take heart that it's not just this one application where that's a challenge, it's sort of across a lot of different applications.
I just thought it was an interesting cultural phenomena popping up. Again, the gentleman now, the one gentleman who's arguing that, you know, that the building automation systems, you know, are not leading technology, they're following technology, and he's quite convinced that, you know, why is buying, installing, commissioning, using, modifying, upgrading, replacing today's building automation system such a headache? You know, you know, in a world where you have Apple leading us with easy to use interfaces. But he says that this divide is not going to be solved by technology, which I think is a very good point. He says the divide can only be solved if the thought leaders come together and try to work it out for the best of everybody. You know, but again, from his point of view, you know, there's one thing that everybody has in common is that with everything going on, the ownership operations team, the stakeholders, you know, they want more use of that data. And, you know, one way or another, they may force people to come to the table on it. So I think that's, you know, probably, you know, part of the way it's going to come. I'm going to ask now if there's, you know, all these new demands on the networks, how are the networks coping? That is, when you have the wonderful Internet of Things coming along, which is truly wonderful, but it places a lot of demands. You know, how are networks coping with the increase in video, the increase with the remote working, the increase from the various sensors and positioning technologies? Phil, I think you have a point on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a mouthful there. Let's just start with data. I mean, every organization that resides in a building has a core business. And that core business, they have to decide on that location. And it could be a location that's a branch of many locations that need to have data consolidated at a headquarter level, let's say, or a corporate level. So data has become more and more. And the more that you speak to, you know, it's BMS companies or other companies out there that are actually collecting data. So it depends on the, I would call it digitalization strategy of what that company is doing. So a lot of times a company has to pay for upgrading their IT infrastructure, okay? And especially if they want to put it on this platform, or they have to decide if they want to outsource to some cloud platform at the same time, because you can do a lot of things with analytics and everything on cloud. I'm not going to get into what's better or what's worse. I think it's just overall a strategy that needs to be done. But I'll just add, needs to add in other people and other stakeholders. Now you mentioned stakeholders, and I like what the person said in the slide, you know, they need to come together, IT and let's call it the OT. On the OT side, you got to get those business leaders and those managers to come by and say, well, look, we're going to be upgrading these over the next years. We got these systems coming in. And sometimes they don't mention that they're going to need access or connect to this data, or they're going to bring more data in, which means adding capacity. And that's what it's about. So I think it's really part of the overall strategy of that company. And the BMS companies have to work together with IT and just like others to say, okay, What's the priority? How do we do it? What's the right way? Because there are many ways to do it.
OT is from Mars and IT is from Venus, or is it the other way around? I'm not sure.
Now you get into relationships now, and that even gets.
So Bob, if I can ask you, regarding this question of how networks are coping with increased demands, I mean, you probably see it in your line of work.
Yeah, I think the big growth, and I think Phil alluded to it, right, is, with the world going digital as opposed to analog signals, and you're getting digital signals from the lighting system, from room sensors, from, all these systems within the building are now digital. So, okay, how do I process and share that information? You need a bigger backbone infrastructure, right? The easiest way is you're putting in switches. If you kind of model it over the traditional kind of IT switch, right? You got switches, the switches share the information through kind of the backbone. So you're seeing, basically you need a strong infrastructure to support it. We've touched a little bit, even if you go, oh great, we're going to go all wireless, there's still a lot of cabling in those types of systems to be able to, cable all of that in, and it's handling that information. If we can, ideally, I think the goal is to get to kind of that converge, so it's all on the same system. I think the challenges as you look at that, and we've talked a little bit about it, is, different devices, right? That room controller needs how much bandwidth capability? Am I going to plug that into the same thing that I'm plugging in a 4K monitor that needs, gigabits or bandwidth capability for it? I think those are still some of the challenges that we have. But, when you look at the backbone, I think it's clear there you're seeing fiber optic because of the distance and the bandwidth capabilities. And I know we'll talk about a little more about that later. But I think you're seeing the trend to look at it and say, okay, we need more bandwidth capability. And how do we do that?
Yeah. From my perspective, continuing sort of on to what Bob was saying, and totally agree about, need for more robust fiber backbone. I've seen three sort of major effects of this conversion of everything over to Ethernet, right? Whether it's a sensor or security camera, whatever. At the end of the day, we're putting more connections onto the network, right? So we have a telco closet, which anybody involved in the cabling industry knows has gotten smaller over years, not bigger. But we're trying to cram more and more connections into the racks and into the telco closet. And so the companies that provide those sorts of products that go into a telco closet have gotten pretty creative about increasing port density within an existing footprint. And so we have things like vertical patching in the cable managers or zero RU patching, figuring out ways to eliminate horizontal cable managers so you can get more equipment in a rack. So that's one thing. I think the second thing we've seen, and this has been probably more in the last 5 years or so, is the equipment in the IDF is moving out of the telco closet, out of the actual physical IDF. So you see switch manufacturers making switches that can live in the ceiling plenum. We're seeing sort of a renewed interest in zone topology for cabling. So people going back and using wall-mounted sort of mini IDFs with a switch and some cabling, or drop-down enclosures that come out of that are mounted up in the ceiling grid, sort of moving closer to the edge, right? As you mentioned, moving the switching and the cabling out away from the closet into a more distributed environment. I think one of the more interesting things I've seen recently is a sort of brand new technology that's coming out, and it's meant to really address the idea of a smart building with all these distributed devices throughout a building that a lot of times don't require the high bandwidth that video does or that a phone call does, or security cameras do. A lot of times these are small, they're sending small bits of information. And so what's going through some of the standards bodies right now is something called single pair Ethernet. And single pair Ethernet is sort of custom made or being designed just for this type of application. So the idea is it's as the name implies, a single balanced twisted pair of cable. It has the form factor on the connector side of something close to an LC connector, if you're familiar with that from the fiber world. So we can get very high density. We're projected to get up to 96 ports in a single RU in a rack or patch panel. And it still provides 10 megabytes of data, which can be plenty for sensors, thermostats, VAVs, sort of, your more sort of basic devices. and also provide the power of the Ethernet. So anywhere from 77 to 52 watts of power, depending on the length of that cable run, which can be as long as 1,000 meters. And so that solves a lot of problems for pushing Ethernet and pushing twisted pair further down into the BMS, down past the zone controllers into those edge devices. And it's probably another year or year and a half away from sort of broad market availability, but it could be a really interesting development that could sort of help continue the digital building trend for us.
A year and a half from now should be very interesting if we have Wi-Fi 6, 5G, and everything else that supposedly would come together. Bob, can I ask you, because I read your article, which was an important component in bringing AV to life, the network infrastructure, and I enjoyed it very much. And I wanted to ask you some of the points you made in there. You know, fiber infrastructure, for example, showing up more. You know, can you talk to that a little bit?
Well, in particular, when you look at it from the AV side, right, fiber optic solves two big issues, right? The big issues that it solves is bandwidth, which we've talked about, and then distance capability within that. You know, when you look at kind of the traditional network that I think the AV infrastructure has, you know, we're starting to see it actually push the envelope farther than your traditional IT network, right? So 4K video, it's almost impossible to buy a monitor now that's not 4K, you know, HDR. So you're looking at 18 gigabit type signal. Well, most people at the kind of the desktop level have kind of leveled off at gigabit type speed. You know, certainly there's encoding and encryption you can do to get it underneath that type of bandwidth speed. But I see AV, you know, again, being really a driver in, hey, I need more bandwidth to the field, right? You know, for that capability. So, you know, you're seeing fiber optic there. I think that fiber has been traditionally in the traditional network, right? Of, you know, the telecommunication room away from what we call the closet. So hopefully we get it a little bit bigger. But you saw those connected back via the switches, via that fiber optic cabling. I think AV has to adapt to that, and then, you know, more to the, hey, if we can put it out into those more remote locations, I think fiber is going to be that connecting source back together within the product.
Okay.
I think the other one we'll talk about later, I think is the power option too, when we get to it. That brings another interesting variable in.
The power option in the sense of
low voltage power, or PoE.
Right. Yeah. I think we should talk about that now. Actually, that sounds like a good subject to address.
Yeah.
Now, there seems to be a renewed interest in power, you know, over Ethernet now, and I'm wondering if you'd like to address that. Anybody?
I'd like to
I think you should start.
Yeah, I think we all probably do. Go ahead, Phil. You can start.
Everybody
just quickly, and I'm going to speak layman here, okay?
Sure.
And I'm not going to name any customers, but I also worked with the IT. We gave them clearly what we wanted, and they ended up putting PoE on my line when I didn't want PoE, and it burnt up quite a few of my devices. Great example, okay, of not having the right requirements set. So PoE, I would say for lighting, no, because it's still proprietary, okay? You're talking about a protocol as opposed to, you know, the communication coming across. So PoE is providing the power of Ethernet, but a lot of people will go out and say, okay, I got a PoE system and it's a lighting system, but the communication protocol is proprietary. So I may be stating the obvious, but people have to understand that, okay? If we're going to open standards and you want to break down those silos, it doesn't make sense to go to a PoE that's proprietary. Maybe a PoE that's on an open standard. KNX can go PoE and all of that. So I just want to make that delineation. And be careful. That can happen where you got devices that may not want PoE and devices that do want PoE. You may have a mix of that in your facility. And through this distribution that Jamie was talking about, maybe that's a solve in the future for that.
So maybe being PO'd is part of PoE. But Bob, I think you have you know, other experiences with it, but there's one right from the front line that sounds like a legitimate miscommunication.
And miscommunication. To that convergent message, absolutely, right, is, you know, but to me, that's the benefit of PoE, is that here's a universal way we can share power. Now, if the people adapting it correctly, if they're not, that's a challenge that you have in the smart building, because the neat thing about PoE is, okay, I can put this manufacturer's, power input device and this one can receive it. It's supposed to do a handshake back and forth before it sends power. So it's a good system on it.
Yeah.
To me, the big thing that happened in 2018 is they went to 4 pairs. So we have 100-watt beat, PoE capability. Whereas before with PoE Plus, you had kind of 30 watts, and 30 watts was great, right? How many, the little wall bricks, the power transformers did eliminate in the AV side. But at 100 watts, we have the capability that I can run monitors on that system. I can run cash registers, computers, laptops, maybe that motor actuator for an HVAC system that I don't have to pull power capability to it. So I think as more manufacturers, and to your point, Phil, if they adopt it to the standard of, hey, great, I can use PoE, and now I have a low voltage, cost energy saving thing that can be throughout the industry. So that's where I see it going. I think the big challenge that you're seeing is how is it going to affect standards? And, you've already seen NEC adopt, control of, hey, anything over 60 watts has to meet these new requirements within the system. Is your cabling rated for it? Is your connectors rated for it? I think you made a point in one of yours, Jamie, on power for it. So there's lots of parameters, but I think power is going to be one of the new requirements when you look at infrastructure is what can your power handle on the copper side?
The BAS side, sorry, Jamie, just on the BAS side, KNX does have the ability as an option for power over Ethernet, as well as a lot of backnet companies. So to your point. Sorry, Jamie.
Yeah, I think the most important thing about PoE is it is standardized. So if you're dealing with a proprietary power delivery system, it was not PoE, right? PoE is very well defined by IEEE and a lot of industry bodies and on how it operates and works. So unfortunate that you had that experience, but I agree with Bob. I would argue we have not seen a renewed interest in PoE. I don't see that it's ever declined, right? As Bob mentioned, the amount of power and current that each successive generation of PoE provides is more and more, and then allows us to power more and more devices. And I love the example of, being able to display or power a display, right? Little power bricks behind a display in a rack and a credenza are probably one of the biggest headaches for techs installing systems today. And the more that you can, tell them, hey, you don't have to worry about that, just plug in a patch cord. That makes installations go more quickly. It reduces installation costs. PoE provides more flexibility. If I want to put a video wall up someplace one day and I don't have power there, then I'm going to have an electrician come out and run it. But likely I've got a cable running overhead in the plenum that I can pull down and plug in and power my display, and boom, I've got digital signage going.
Okay. I'm going to be asking the audience if they have any questions to put them forward, but I do have one already. And that is, are there any current integrations with fire life safety networks, or do they always have to stand alone? So
I'll take a stab at that one. They tend to be standalone because they're very regulated, as the person asked. So, but with that regulation, in a lot of cases, the fire alarm companies that are out there, or not companies, the systems, they actually validate their own systems. So actually the fire marshal comes out and they validate their own systems. So it's kind of like, you approving your own, house estimate, to appraise your house. So bottom line is they are been very standalone. Now Siemens, as an example, will integrate all those together, but it's on their platform. So it's really a driver they have personally for them. I did see a company, and I don't know the names, but they have actually, they've been approved and by all the NFPA and standards to have kind of a SCADA system where they can actually bring the data up and they can share that across in a BMS. And it's all approved. So it's kind of like, I wouldn't say a gateway, but very, very robust interface. So I can't state in technology on there, but it can happen, goes that direction. You are having some interfaces to fire, but I would say fire needs to be standalone in a lot of ways, especially hardwired interlocks with air handling units, all that stuff we all know. However, when it comes down to a SCADA and read writing points, you want to keep that kind of separate. That's where you need, there's a balance. So I believe there'll be some cases where customers need to have probably more transparency on their fire side, and you should be able to get a lot of that data from there. And I would say the trend hasn't been a lot from what I've seen. Typically standard, it stays standalone.
Okay. Another question from the audience regarding the network training again. Which protocols should a smart building consultant become familiar with? Which protocols?
I don't know, Bob or Jamie want to go in?
Sounds like you, Philip.
Sounds like you, Philip.
That's like, I'll kick that back. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, look, if you ask me personally, I would say BACnet for your automation level. So all your central plant, HVAC, all of these things you want to have on BACnet. Okay. Yeah. What you want to have also on probably the room level side, I really strongly suggest KNX, because you can actually interface the HVAC lighting and blinds, which is not done a lot here in the US. So you can incorporate all those there. And both of those are part of standard ASHRAE standard 135. So KNX and BACnet together. So already the interoperability is there, the OT, if you will, of BMS. So we're doing automation level BACnet, KNX, and then an IP convergence platform. Okay, and there are a few out there. We have ours in Ascend. Of course, I am promoting that. But you have also Tritium from Honeywell and some other platforms that can integrate pretty much all of those open protocols and standards. That's the important thing. So my suggestion would be an IP convergence platform, but keep it on your automation and field level where your sensors and devices are. Keep them on KNX, automation level BACnet.
See, I think the issue, I think the issue is that if you're going to be a smart building consultant, I mean, if you have one of these protocols, down, you can do some work. But if you're actually going to be an integrator and integrating, isn't the value in knowing multiple protocols and being able to engage in discussions of different protocols. And I think that's what scares a lot of integrators, is how much really do I have to learn? And that's probably what the audience wants to know is, but I think by attending the Power Hour, you get a certain background, which hopefully will point you in different directions. I would not encourage many people. I would encourage some companies, but not many people, to try to tackle everything at once. It's such a big knowledge area that you're better off, picking one thing at a time and digesting it. Bob, you have a comment?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. As I kind of look at it from our viewpoint or mine is, the challenge is you can't be an expert in all the fields, right? It's hard to know building automation and life safety and, phone systems, is all of that. As the IP system is the interconnecting, understanding, how we're sharing information. Hey, great, I'm going to get this packet. Maybe how do I tie into that room sensor that you're putting in? Great, this is going to come over the IP system. Here's the traffic, so I'll be able to tie into my system. But yeah, that strong IT and the switching gear of how do we pull that off and label it within the network.
And Phil, I have a reader that wants to know, is it BACnet IP or traditional BACnet?
Oh, nice. MSTP. No, BACnet over IP. Excuse me. All the protocols mentioned are all over IP, hence IP convergence. As I may also probably a suggestion, and it's more, what was the slide you had before about it's just people coming together. If you really look at master specifications, I'll say it again, there's a division 25 for integrated automation. So if you want to tackle that, you can put your open protocols and standards inside there. We talked about wired mostly a lot. There are wireless applications. Point is, at every level, is you need to have open standards as much as possible. So I saw IP Bliss. You got KNX BACnet right there. So there's one conversion already where you can access them. So open standards, no proprietary, and you should be fine. Now you want to understand a lot of the protocols. I didn't mention Modbus and others. However, it's good to know them. I mean, I've been in the business a long time, so I've seen a lot of systems, but I'm not suggesting people go in there. But there may be a niche you have, like you may want to do some lighting and go into lighting and be a lighting expert. And that's not easy. Integrating, that's the probably easier part. It's to be good at that business, but then make sure you're open to everybody, because you don't want to lock yourself out or your customer into protocol that they can't get out of and you're stuck with the manufacturer.
Yeah, so the protocols can be double-edged sword. I think we're getting down to the end of time here, and I wanted to mention that the next Power Hour, we're going to be dedicated onto wireless and security. I say it'd be nice to fit all these subjects into one session, but then we'd be chatting all the day there. I think just as we sign out here, guys, any last comments on what people should know about network infrastructure or control as we sign off? Anybody have any last comment? Okay, I think we've probably done our job here. Thank you, folks.
Thank you, speakers.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you,
Thanks, Jamie and Phil.
listeners. Thank you, listeners, for joining today's webinar, Smart Buildings Power Hour Control and Backbone. This recording will be available on avixa.org/webinars within about 5 business days, and your 1 RU credit will be applied to your transcripts within 5 to 7 business days. If you have any trouble, please contact webinars@avixa.org. And a huge thank you to Bob and guests for providing insights into integrating AV into smart buildings to automate processes and systems. We hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.